Good morning, everybody. My name is Karen Williams and I'm Principal Solicitor for ADA Law, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm coming to you from today, the Turrbal and Yagara people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also acknowledge that people are tuning in to this webinar from all over Queensland and maybe nationally as well, and certainly our guest presenter we're coming to you from Melbourne. So just to do a bit of housekeeping, mics will be automatically muted and questions can be submitted to us via the Q&A chat on the portal. To get us going this morning, as we hand over to our guest presenter, we're going to have 3 polling questions, and it'd be great if you could sort of hop in and answer those as soon as you can, just to get us thinking about our topic. And also, we're sort of this webinar comes to you foreshadowing some changes in the legal framework, and there's some more resources in the handout section. We're not proposing to go through that in detail, but we do have that information for you there. I'd also like to thank our sponsors for this event. So we're able to bring you this webinar from a grant from the Queensland Government investing in Queensland Women. So it's great that we're able to secure that funding and able to bring you such a very rich session this morning. Okay, so now I'd like to welcome our guest presenter, who's Dr Catherine Barrett, who's the founder and director of Celebrate Ageing. Catherine, as you'll discover, if you haven't met Catherine before, is a very passionate advocate in challenging ageism and ensuring that people experiencing sexual assault get the responses that they need across the service sector and professional sector in the community. Yes, so Catherine brings her perspective from a nurse, an academic and an advocate. So today we'll have a presentation by Dr Catherine Barrett. Then we're going to give us all a chance to sort of process the information and have some guided discussions in 3 discussion groups. Now, because of the size of the group this morning, some people may find themselves randomly allocated. If this hasn't occurred, you can choose which group that you'd like to be part of. Then the group facilitators will take the key themes back, and we'll have some key insights from Catherine again, and responding to those themes, answers some of the top few questions that Catherine will be able to respond to, and then we'll have a quick closing. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to we'll do the polling questions first. So let's do those. I'll just quickly run through them. They're on the portal. So firstly is, do you think older people experience sexual assault in their own homes? Do you think you have professional responsibility to report sexual assault regarding clients receiving home care? And also the third polling question, if a client disclosed sexual assault, would you know what information to give them? So there are 3 opening polling questions for today, and it'd be great if you could respond to those as soon as possible. So now I'll hand you over to Dr Catherine Barrett for her presentation today. Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks, Karen. I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging. I also want to acknowledge that today's a really significant milestone. We are starting to really acknowledge sexual assault of older people as a problem, first in residential aged care and now in home-based services, and that's incredibly important. So I'm really thrilled to be here today to address this issue. And as Karen said, my background's aged care, mostly residential aged care as a unit manager, nurse unit manager, and then in academia, a sexual health and ageing program, and now this work as the director of Celebrate Ageing, a charity challenging ageism and building respect for older people. So I'm really thrilled to be here with you today. Today, what we're going to be doing is I'm going to share with you a little bit of information about the Ready to Listen project. And that's the project I've been coordinating for the last 18 months. It has focused on residential aged care. And what we're doing today is drawing some of the lessons from the Ready to Listen project and previous work that I've been involved in, Norma's project, the first evidence based on sexual assault of older women in Australia. So some of the drawing on the evidence to really consider what service providers need to know to help prevent and support victims in their own homes. We're going to look at a brief definition of what sexual assault is, and it'll become clear as the presentation goes on that there's a real need to do that. We're going to look at prevalence and reporting, or particularly the barriers to reporting, and then the drive, which is really topical in the context of the launch of the National Plan to Prevent Violence Against Women and Their Children this week. Then we will have just a short reflection on changing the story. And this is the work by Our Watch, which is the national organisation focused on primary prevention of sexual assault, or how do we prevent sexual assault before it happens? And we're going to think about what does that mean for older people in their own homes. And then I'm going to share with you some scenarios from the research from Norma's project, some scenarios of sexual assault at home. And it's a way then of understanding what older people are experiencing, what they need, and how you might support older people as service providers. And we'll finish with another piece of research that I was involved in called Someone in Her Corner. And it's this idea that some of the strategies for supporting older people experiencing sexual assault are really simple, but of course it's almost always quite a complex situation as well. So that's what we're going to be doing for the next half hour. And what I want to do is acknowledge, as I have with all the presentations on older people's sexuality and sexual assault in particular, is that I think what we've done with service providers is we've not given them information about older people and sexual assault, and we have not given them information about older people's sexuality. And this means that I think some service providers are going to work and encountering sexual expression and sexual assault and trying to respond in ways they know best. And I think that what we're doing without giving them education and resources is that we're asking them to put out a bushfire with a garden hose. This is really can be incredibly complex to respond to sexual assault. And I don't think we're really, I think it's really quite unfair actually to be not providing service providers with information and education and resources, because so many service providers want to make a difference, and they can't do so without education and resources. And the approach that we're taking is, if you like, the sprinkler system in a building. It's about putting systems and processes in place. It's about preparing proactively so that service providers sort of aren't caught unawares, that they have strategies in place, they know what to do. So that's the perspective that we're coming from today. I'm just waiting for the slides to click over. I want to add that I think being ready to listen, whether it's in residential aged care or at home, is about leadership. And I'll talk more about that as the project progresses. But this is a quote from Craig Gear, who is the CEO of OPAN, the Older Persons Advocacy Network. And Craig says, being ready to listen is about understanding the risk of sexual assault, knowing the indicators, believing those who disclose, acknowledging impacts, providing support, taking proactive steps to protect older people in this case. Craig's reference was to residential aged care, but just thinking about what this means at home. Sexual assault of older people is never okay. Being ready to listen is an important first step in prevention. And Craig's leadership on this is incredibly important. Craig is the first CEO of a national aged care peak to step up and say, this is something that we need to do some work about. And Craig spoke to the Department of Health about the need to do some work on preventing sexual assault in residential aged care. And we want to acknowledge the Department of Health and the Older Women's Network for their leadership in supporting change in residential aged care. And I want to acknowledge as well too, for ADA law as well too, there's real leadership there as well too, from Jeff Rowe, and you heard from Karen previously, and Jason Abraham and others who are really saying this is an issue that's incredibly important to older people. Older people have the right to be free from sexual assault, and even though not everybody recognises that, we think it's incredibly important. We're stepping up to do something about it, and that leadership is incredibly important. And I want to acknowledge Di McLeod and the fabulous people at the Gold Coast Centre Against Sexual Violence. They've been doing work on preventing sexual assault of older women for quite some time. And as the presentation goes on, I hope you'll see that this is really about leadership. It's about, and you don't need to be a CEO to be a leader. Everybody is a leader, and being equipped with information and education and resources gives you the opportunity to lead, even providing support or referral for people experiencing sexual assault in their own homes. The Ready to Listen project, you'll see that on the OPAN website, there's a Ready to Listen webpage. For residential, we developed a 10-point map. And the map, the 10 elements of the map, you can see there, it's about the things that service providers need to know and understand to prevent sexual assault and to better support victim survivors. And so it's about understanding the definitions, sexual rights, vulnerability, impacts. There's a myth that in residential aged care, in 58% of sexual assaults, service providers don't think sexual assault is harmful. So these are some of the things that the myths that we need to challenge in residential aged care. And we're going to be looking at some of that work today and how it might apply to the home-based context. In terms of a definition of sexual assault, this one's quite a long one, but there's a couple of key points that I want to highlight for you. So this is the definition from the quality of care principles, and there are similarities to most definitions of sexual assault, and that is basically, in the context of services, a sexual assault, or as the Aged Care Quality and Safety Commission refer to, unlawful sexual contact and inappropriate sexual conduct. We don't use that language. We talk about sexual assault because a lot of service providers can't remember or can't relate to that language. And I think we've got to be able to say the words to be able to talk about the issue. So any sexual contact or conduct between a staff member or a volunteer and a client is a sexual assault. Anything without consent is also a sexual assault. And so that's just a really basic definition that we think people need to understand, because some people really are not clear. I think, and we'll share some examples with you shortly. And in terms of the legislation in Queensland, the way sexual assault is defined differs in all states and territories. And in Queensland, the fabulous John Chesterman, who's the public advocate, and his team are looking at the sexual assault or sexual consent legislation in Queensland. And this is the report they've come up with. And one of the things that John is looking at challenging is the Queensland Criminal Code of 1899, which is still in existence, which says, in relation to people with an impairment of the mind, so thinking particularly of people with dementia, very old clunky language, if someone supporting a person with a disability has helped to facilitate a sexual encounter, that could be considered enabling or aiding that offence, and the supporter could be considered a party and could be charged with committing the offence. So wanting you to understand that there's some antiquated laws that are out there, but this is the context that you're working in. And this one as well too, there has been a shift across the country from consent approaches that talk about assent to affirmative consent laws. And there's talk of that happening in Queensland as well too. And that's a really important context for preventing sexual assault at home. And if I was to tell you the difference between assent and affirmative approaches to consent, Teresa Flavin, who's a dementia educator and advocate, says it's the absence of no doesn't mean yes. And she believes that there is a belief that service providers think that because an older woman doesn't say no, she must mean yes. And we see that across a lot of the narratives, and that needs to be challenged. And it looks like that's coming to Queensland as well. So in terms of the context, the language matters. And I want to share with you this appalling quote from Sir Matthew Hale, who was the former Lord Justice of England and Wales. And he's talking here about marital rape immunity laws. And they're a really important context for responding to sexual assault at home. So marital rape immunity laws were in place until the 1980s. And in relation to that, in like, I don't know, 1690 or something like that, he wrote, "The husband cannot be guilty of rape committed by himself upon his lawful wife, for by their matrimonial consent and contract, the wife hath given up herself in this kind unto her husband, which she cannot retract." And basically what he is saying is that a woman became a man's property when she married, and men did not have to negotiate consent. And if a man raped his wife, he could not, it wasn't considered rape. And so that law was changed in the 1980s in Australia. It's still in place in a number of other countries. But the older people that you will be working with have spent, the older heterosexual people, have spent most of their married lives with this as a context for the dynamic. I guess it established a power imbalance. And even though the law was changed, there is, as there often is, no education, no community education campaign to say this law is antiquated, it needs to be changed, and really everybody needs to negotiate consent, whether this is your wife or your new partner. Or but that isn't the case. And so there is, I guess, a kind of a culture in heterosexual relationships for older people where women still feel, many women still feel a sense of duty to provide for their husband's sexual needs. And this is a real barrier to providing support for older women who are being sexually assaulted by their husbands. And we'll talk about that more when we, a little bit further on in the scenarios. So in the context of sexual assault more broadly, the prevalence in the community, we know that most victim survivors are women. 1 in 6 women in Australia have been sexually assaulted since the age of 15. So we know we've got a problem with sexual assault in this country, as we have in many other countries. Men experience sexual assault as well too. Most perpetrators are men, and trans and gender diverse people experience sexual assault at 4 times the rate of the broader community. And I want to acknowledge that that sexual assault is often motivated by transphobia or a hatred of trans and gender diverse people. But there's some complications in the analysis of this data and what we understand to be the prevalence of sexual assault. And I want to reflect on that really briefly because it matters to you as service providers. We know that in the broader community that 8 out of 10 women who are sexually assaulted don't report it to the police. So we know there's a problem of underreporting, and this is a problem for older women as well too. And what about the analysis of data? We see in the analysis of sexual assault data, in the analysis, we often see in the reflections or the discussion on the results of a national survey, for example, we often see people will say younger women experience sexual assault as, in higher rates than older women. We don't actually know that. And, most probably that is the case, but we can't say that's a statement of fact, because what we actually know from a lot of these studies is that younger women are reporting sexual assault at higher rates than older women are reporting it. And we need to stop and say, and why is that the case? And I think it's really important to acknowledge that we have not given older women, in particular, older people more broadly, but we have not given older women, who are most of the victims of sexual assault, we've not given them permission to talk about sexual assault. Now, that really matters because if there's a survey on sexual assault, an older woman might be being sexually assaulted, we might refer to it as sexual assault, by a husband every night, but is not referring to it as sexual assault. Or she's grown up with marital rape immunity laws and doesn't have that sense of legal entitlement to, or is worried about that she will be disloyal if she reports what's happening, or is worried that it's going to create difficulties for her husband. So we've got to look at the data and say, what does that actually mean that older women are reporting sexual assault in lower rates than younger women? And this matters because the data, when we look at this data, this national data, this data is used to allocate funding. It's used to identify priorities, and it's used to prevent sexual assault. And so then we create this cycle where we're doing research on sexual assault. Older women seem to have less sexual assault than younger women, so let's focus on younger women. And all the way through, there's this cycle then of not giving older women permission to talk about sexual assault. It's incredibly important then for you in your services, if you're gathering data on the issues, if it's elder abuse or the issues that your older clients are experiencing, and if you're not gathering that data on sexual assault, and for example, you believe that most of what older people are experiencing is continence issues or financial abuse, and that's the focus you put in. What I want you to do with this slide is think about, if you're not having, if sexual assault is not being reported, that does not mean it's not happening, and it does not mean it's not prevalent. It just means it's not being reported. And it's incredibly important that we give older people permission to talk about sexual assault. Otherwise, they don't feel safe to report it. In surveys on elder abuse, often you'll hear service providers say the most common form of abuse and sexual assault is rare, but we don't know. That's not a statement of fact. That's a statement of reflection on what was shown up in the data. And again, we've got to come back to saying, if we've not opened up conversations about sexual assault, and unless we do that, we're not going to get change. So the vulnerability of older people, I think when I first started working in sexual assault, when someone was sexual assaulted and I was supporting an organisation through that, quite often what I did in my work was focus on the perpetrator and the victim. But what I have learned through this work is what's referred to as a social ecological model. And that's really an understanding that it's not just about what happens between the victim and the perpetrator, it's what happens in services. You know, are service providers giving the information, education, resources to open up conversations about sexual assault, to support people who disclose, and to help make people safe. And I think all of that is a reflection on an ageist, sexist, ableist world that really has not recognised sexual assault of older people, or older women in particular, as a problem. Our Watch is a national organisation that focuses on primary prevention, and they talk about the drivers of violence. And I think it's really interesting to reflect on that for a moment and say, well, how does this apply to older victims of sexual assault and older women in particular? And, you know, I think the drivers are still the same. The first one in particular is that we don't take a stand and say sexual assault of older women and older people is not okay. And even in the community movements, you know, the Me Too or the March for Equality, in these rallies that are so incredibly important, we're not really recognising the experiences of older people. So I think those drivers are still there. But I think what's really interesting, if you look at the social context down the bottom, they're talking about ageism and ableism as well as sexism. And the work I'm doing at the moment with people living with dementia, they're saying it's ableist, that most victim survivors of sexual assault in residential aged care are older women living with dementia, and we're not really recognising this as an issue. So this is ageist and ableist. And this is an appalling cartoon, I think, that really highlights some of the drivers of violence for older women. The disrespect for older women in our community is really quite horrendous. And if you look at the disadvantage that older women experience, more likely to experience family violence, elder abuse, homelessness, more likely to be carers, more likely to be financially disadvantaged. And I think if you bring that back to say, what is this about? I think there is a particularly caustic form of ageism that is directed to older women. We laugh at their bodies, we think they are asexual, and we think that they would be so sexually desperate they would not mind who touched them. But I have to tell you that after listening to hundreds of stories from people living with dementia, they do care. They do care who touches them, and respect for older women matters, and older women count. And it's incredibly important that we say that, because in so much of what we do, it is not felt. So change the story. This is another approach to primary prevention. And this is from Our Watch, which is the peak body looking at primary prevention, or how we turn this around, you know, how we support victims and survivors, but how do we actually turn this around? And I think reflecting on what I know in over 25 years of sexual assault prevention is that there's sort of a misconception in a way that sexual assault is of an older woman in their own home, if someone breaks through the window and an older woman is sexually assaulted, but actually it's our inaction that leads to older women's vulnerability. And this is a story that really shocked me, and it was an aged care worker or a provider of home-based services who sexually assaulted an older woman in her own home while her husband was there. And I think so often we don't prepare our organisations, our services, for making it really clear to service providers what the expectations are in relation to sexual assault or sexual relationships or sexual encounters. And changing the story is about understanding what makes older people vulnerable and putting policies and processes and education in place to prevent sexual assault. So now I want to share with you some stories, and these stories, real stories from the research, really reflect the experiences of older and sexual assault at home. And so this first one is from, and it was an interview with an advocacy service provider. An older woman was basically raped, if not nightly, but almost by a husband who had dementia. He had previously been a very loving partner, and she knew that he wasn't in control of what he was doing, but it was enormously stressful for her. And she was deeply humiliated by the circumstances and was fearful about what would happen to him. And this is a really common scenario in terms of sexual assault of people, of older women in particular, by partners who are hypersexual or sexually disinhibited because of dementia. And a survey response from an aged care service provider, there was an older woman who was frail and struggling to care for her husband who had dementia. Her own health issues and carer status meant her social withdrawal and weepiness was put down to stress and ill health by workers who saw her regularly. It was only when a new worker probed a little further into how they were coping, the wife disclosed that she was being sexually assaulted by a husband. The dementia had rendered her husband incapable of determining her consent or willingness, and she was afraid to tell anyone because she felt she needed to protect her husband. So I think we do an incredible disservice to people at home by not opening up conversations about what they're experiencing. And I think this second story really highlights the power of home care workers to really do an assessment just by interaction with someone and just noticing that someone's changed, that they're weepy or tired. Incredibly important observations. And the power of information, education and support from an aged care service provider. What is really tragic is that a lot of carers, especially where the partner has dementia, is they're using sex as a means of calming the person down. Their partner, who obviously they once loved and had a good sexual relationship with, has become disinhibited or hypersexual. And these women are actually agreeing to it because it's the quickest pathway to calm the person down. So I think we're doing older women and older people a disservice if we're not providing them with options other than succumbing to sexual relations with their partner because they don't know how else to settle someone down. And in the context of family violence, an interview with an aged care service provider, one of the staff was contacted by an older woman about a partner rape recently, but it wasn't anything new. It was really domestic violence that had essentially carried on into old age, apparently 41 years worth. And I've spoken to older women who've experienced family violence all their married life, but have never understood that what they were experiencing was family violence and did not understand that family violence services were there for them and did not understand the power of family violence services to transform what they were experiencing. And an interview with a sexual assault service provider, one older woman I worked with could not disclose the sexual assaults by her husband to her children for fear they would suicide out of shame. And she was being raped all these years. When the offender died, she came to us, but she was unable to tell her own sons for fear that the shame would kill them or they'd kill themselves as a result. And so one of the significant obstacles here in families is shame, and how do you open up conversations with victim survivors so that they can be free of sexual assault without having, without taking on that shame themselves. And in rural communities, I think incredibly important, particularly for you in Queensland, but across the country. I spoke with one older woman, who literally walked in to find her mother in distress because her father was sexually assaulting her. And she was really alarmed about it and came to appreciate that this was not a new thing. And she was not willing to name her parents or herself or take any steps for fear of her mother's safety. And in this scenario, so often there are layers and layers and layers. And one of the other layers is, and there's a family business. They own a family business. And if it gets out, then what are the impacts on the family business? And we could access the local sexual assault service, but then everyone in town will know that dad is sexually assaulting mum. And then mum is also saying, well, I've got children and grandchildren, and if I label this rape and my husband a rapist, then what happens to my relationship with my children and my grandchildren? And I'm 86. So these are the levels and layers that we need to understand. And then this is a long one, but I think it's the final scenario I want to share with you, and it really encapsulates so much of sexual assault of older women in particular in their own homes. So we were working with a woman, and let's call her Mary, who was being repeatedly raped by her husband. And there were 3 sons, and she was trying to tell them, without saying the sexual violence part, to tell them about what was happening to her, and that she didn't really want to stay in the home anymore because she was in her 80s and really quite frail. Now, the sons didn't want to hear about it. In the end, she was saying to them, he wants sex all the time. And they were, well, what's the problem with that? And then kind of joking about their father's prowess. The 3 sons and the husband were all tied up in the property they worked on, and 2 of the sons still lived at home, and they were all drinkers. So clearly her first disclosure to the sons was they were not empathetic. They discounted and downplayed her fears and her concerns. And she was quiet probably for a year after that, until the husband, who had dementia and was being prescribed Viagra, ended up with a caseworker, and that caseworker built trust. And she disclosed what was going on, and then she got an empathetic response. And the way that they were able to handle this was to involve the doctor and look at the unintended outcomes of him continuing to have Viagra, and also by getting him regular respite so the woman could have some kind of life. Eventually, she went into care because of his dementia, and she was able to carve out a bit of a life for herself. And I want to just reflect on a couple of the key issues in this story, because this reflects, I think, so much of what we need to understand about sexual assault of older people in their own homes. There is a vulnerability, and that can be, increased layers around people who are living rurally or remotely. There is a dependence, and what are the options for older women who want to move out? Are women's shelters inclusive of family violence services inclusive? What about access to children and grandchildren, and in the last years of older women's lives? And the minimising and dismissing is really, really common, a really common response. And for younger women, what was she wearing? She was having drinks. Was she drunk? She drunk too much? It wasn't that. Couldn't have been that bad. And there, that manifests in a different way with older women, but the impact is still the same. It's really dismissing older women who report, and the gender inequalities there that the sons were saying, well, that's wonderful that he's his sexual prowess. The importance of listening. So it was the home care workers who really made a difference, and you have so much power to make a difference to the lives of the older people that you're providing services to by listening. And as Margarita Sola says, not just with your ears, with your eyes, and asking again, giving older people permission to talk about what they're experiencing. So often older people won't talk about sexual assault because they're ashamed. And so if they're experiencing financial abuse, they might talk to you about that, but not about the sexual assault. But you need to know about the sexual assault because there's a different set of strategies, a different set of supports. Giving older women choices. If someone talks about sexual assault, the strategy, the safety plan might not be to whisk the older woman out of that service. In the case, out of their home. In the case of Mary, it was sitting down and having a conversation with her and finding out what she wanted. She wanted to stay in the home, actually. And so it's all right, well, let's give your husband respite. And that gave her a chance to look at her own health and well-being until he went into residential aged care. And I think the concept that it is our business. I love that the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Their Children has a section on what's it called? Collective responsibility, and the idea that there's a whole of community response. This is not just about what happens in residential aged care. It's not just about the responsibility of home care providers. The police have a role to play here. The law courts have a role to play here. Family violence services, sexual assault services, DB masters, everybody has a role to play here. And it is our business to make sure that older people know the choices that they have. And I think the power of service providers to transform the lives of older people who are experiencing sexual assault. You know, with Mary, her life was transformed. She was able to stay in her own home because a home care worker listened. So that's it. And what I want to do just by final way is to reflect on some of the strategies for responding to victim survivors and preventing sexual assault. And so this is some research I was involved in, which we interviewed older women and service providers about how to prevent sexual assault. And this was the reflections on what happens at home. And I think the report sums it up really beautifully, this concept of her corner. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But hopefully what you've seen from the examples I've shared with you, the importance of listening, you know, with your eyes and your ears and your heart, listening and asking again, giving opportunities, giving permission to speak about it. That's a really incredibly important part of skilled assessment. Building trust, so that, you know, in Mary's case, so that Mary feels that she can trust the service providers that are coming in, and just you know, building those relationships so that she feels that she is able to disclose. And then building confidence in service providers as well too. So for home care workers, so that they have the information, they feel confident opening up a conversation about what older people are experiencing. And then what happens if someone does disclose, you know, making sure that home care workers know then who they can talk to. Can they talk to their team leader? Can you organise an in-service education with the local sexual assault or family violence service? Can you do a secondary consultation with those services or with the police so that you can find out what the options are, and then bring those back to Mary and tell her what her choices are? The relationships between home care services and local family violence, sexual assault or police services are incredibly important. We've seen that time and time again, that where there is a relationship, there's a shared knowledge, there's education that happens, and there's much more likely to be that secondary consultation, or home care services feeling confident and comfortable ringing up a sexual assault or a family violence service and saying, now, you know, I can't tell you who this is, but this is happening, and what are, you know, the options in this case? And then I think the final one I want to talk about is organisational leadership. That we've seen that with the ReadyToListen project in residential aged care, and with the work that ADA is doing. And it takes, I think it takes some courage to actually stand up and say, we have a problem with sexual assault of older people and we want to do something about it. We know that that's happening across the country in just about every other context. It needs to happen around the provision of home-based services. And, you know, there needs to be policies and guidelines and education so that home care workers are really clear. And, you know, there is an issue that I see time and time again around sexual boundaries as well too, that sometimes service providers don't understand where being friendly intersects with becoming a friend, and how you maintain a professional boundary. And I think it's been quite a shock for me to recognise that actually we need to have policies that state that this is what sexual assault is, and any sexual relationship between a worker and a client will be considered sexual assault and will be reported to the police. There will be instant dismissal, you know, being really clear where the boundaries are and what the consequences are, and then delivering education so everybody knows about it. That's the leadership that it takes here. And I think, just to finish, having someone in her corner, a beautiful home care service that I spoke to knew that there was an older woman. They could just sense that an older woman was being sexually assaulted. And so the home care worker that had the best relationship with her said, do you mind me asking, I was caring for someone, or I was in someone's home last week, she was in a really similar position to you, and her husband was being a sexual pest. So, because the older woman might not use the language of sexual assault, he was being a sexual pest, and there were demands being placed on her sexually. Do you mind me asking, is that something that happened to you? And the older woman said yes, and broke down crying. And in the conversations about her safety plan, the older woman didn't want to leave. But what they recognised they would do would be to increase the supports that she was having at home. And they called that someone in her corner, so that she felt like she was really being supported until she was able to put the steps in place to stop the sexual assault, which actually was leaving. But it was about saying, what is it that she wants and how can we help her to achieve that? So that's a really quick summary of ReadyToListen insights for home. I hope that's been helpful, and I'm really looking forward to having the conversations with you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Catherine, and you've really given us a lot to work with there in that presentation. And we'll have an opportunity very shortly to unpack some of the aspects of the presentation in the talk, and then have some further question and answers with you as well. Before we break into groups, I'm just wanting to share the poll results. So the first one, do you think older people experience sexual assault in their homes? So we've got 93% yes and 7% no. Do you think we have professional responsibility to report sexual assault of clients? And we've similar breakdown of results there. And then if a client disclosed sexual assault, would you know what information to give them? And so that can really see the purpose of the webinar here is unpacked in this response, that people aren't as confident with their responses. So hopefully through the conversations and listening to the stories today and looking at the online resources and also having further conversations with our colleagues, that will be of help. Okay, so now we're going to go to our breakout rooms, and you'll either be allocated or you'll be able to choose. So just waiting for that to go. So okay, so there's breakout room 1, strategies to open. So we've got room 1. There'll be 3 rooms that will come up for you. Excellent. Thank you, everybody, and for all of those conversations. And I hope everyone else enjoyed their conversations as much as I did mine. What we're going to do is sort of take the key themes from each of the conversations and just give some feedback to Catherine, and for Catherine to cast her wisdom across and just have some responses of where to. I might just start with mine, seeing that I'm on air. Here's everyone else, all our other facilitators and Catherine. So I was in group 2 about increasing organisational awareness and responsiveness and enhancing interagency and intersect collaboration. So we were hampered by technical difficulties at my end, but my group were hung in there and came up with some really good questions, which I've hopefully can formulate. So there was part of the discussion was concern about people going outside their boundaries, that in being over helpful and just talking about how important the trusting relationship was in the home care environment, and that people might respond to the older person as they would a friend, and you know, and not have a more considered response. So maybe let's start with that, Catherine.
That's an incredibly important one. And I think without any guidelines or education or policy to guide service providers, people will respond from their own personal values and beliefs. And that's why we need policies and guidelines around sexual boundaries, around professional boundaries. I mean, there's sort of an awareness of professional boundaries around gift giving. And organisations that, you know, I notice on a number of websites, people will have, you know, information about that. It's really clear, you know, our staff, you know, won't be able to accept any gifts from you. You know, that kind of being really clear. We've got to be really clear around sexual assault and sexual boundaries as well too. And then educate service providers, make sure everybody knows. And so it's the kind of things like, you know, where is a sexual boundary? You know, can you hug someone? Can they kiss you on the cheek? Is that acceptable to the organisation? And then what if somebody does something else? You know, somebody has a hug, and well, the other worker that came in has a hug and she manages it all right, but I actually felt really quite sexually intimidated. Well, if it's we can't put workers in a position where they've got to work out how to manage that themselves. We could have a policy or guidelines that say, you know, being friendly is, you know, you may want to kiss somebody on the cheek or shake their hands or say hello, but if someone hugs you or if someone's touching you, that's not okay. And it's not okay for you to touch somebody other than, you know, their intimate care. So I think the problem that we've got is the ageism and sexism and ableism. That means we've not thought of older people as sexual. Not actually the group that I was just in, you know, very enlightened group of people. But I think by and large, there aren't policies and guidelines for service providers. And so we've got to have that information really explicitly documented. Imagining a worker who goes in and sexually assaults a client. How did he think that was okay? You know, it sort of beggars belief. So I think giving people really clear guidelines, and that's one of the really significant problems we have.
And training to those guidelines. So there's also discussion about, you know, well, where can organisations go to? Is there a peak body to get the support, you know, through, you know, for the training, but also for individual cases? You know, where can organisations go to get that sort of input and support? And are you aware of organisations and where might you suggest?
Yep. So one of the incredibly important things that I think we need to do is a ReadyToListen at home. We need to do a national project that helps service providers develop the policies and education, make it freely available. But ADA law, like Jason has been amazing. We've worked together for the last 18 months. So being able to call ADA law and just go, or ADA Australia and just go, this is what I'm dealing with, what ideas do you have? But the other people are sexual assault services and family violence services. And time again, even having that remote connection, if you're not able to meet face to face, but making a connection with your local sexual assault service and actually having that relationship means that when you're worried about something, you can actually ring and just go, oh, Karen, this is happening. Have you got any ideas what I should do? So being able to ring 1-800-RESPECT, find out who your local family violence or sexual assault service is, and building relationships, I think is core.
We did note that there's a long way to go because as people reported that their experiences, they're not used to framing the service response in respect of an older person, and we also noted that generic elder abuse services may not be able to have the specific. So there's probably work in a number of sectors there, Catherine, that you outlined, but needs a particular focus, in the home care sector. So that's excellent. Well, I might hand over to Jason, maybe next, to ask some questions from your group.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Karen. And we had the benefit of having Catherine in our group for some of that, which is great. We were talking about communication and looking at language, and I guess when you mentioned sexual assault and nuance that with the legal definitions there, that can be a barrier to communication. What would you say, Catherine, to that when we're kind of wrestling with language and the evolution of language? What would be a starting point for us?
I think one of the things that I've seen done effectively time and time again is if there's a service provider who's concerned, to open up a conversation. I think I talked about this in the presentation, being able to say, I was delivering services last week to someone who was in a really similar position, and she was, her husband was being a sexual pest and she wasn't able to sleep at night. And so, we put in some services to help her so that she could continue looking after her husband at home. And do you mind me asking, is that something that happened to you? So that letting older women or older people know that they're not alone, that this is something that other people experience. And that we talked in a group, Jason, about the shame and how that can be a barrier, but we can do a lot to support victim survivors without having to, even engage the family or engage the town. And I think in the group as well too, really beautiful point that was made is that, the idea of working with the victim and the perpetrator, but somebody talked about actually taking it off the individual and throwing it back to the whole town, and having the education and information for the whole town so that they know that this is what's acceptable and what's not, and what supports are out there.
Yeah, we also talked about judgments that we have and then judgments that others have, and how that plays on communication, particularly regarding sexual assault and being able to kind of engage in that topic. Is it something that only happens to younger people? Why is the data not as prevalent? Why does the data not show the same kind of prevalence as younger people? Is that a funding issue? Is that an awareness issue? Is that an education issue? What would you say to that, Catherine?
It's an ageism issue. It's ageism. And older women experience a particularly caustic form of ageism at the intersections with sexism. If you look at the stats on the inequalities, gender inequalities for older women. And, as acknowledged before as well too, older men experience sexual assault, trans and gender diverse people. But this is ageism, the belief that sexual assault prevalence surveys don't need to think about the sexual assault of older women, or that elder abuse, Yeah, but particularly in the broader sexual assault data, you know, the fact that older women, if it's a survey of violence against women, that we're not focusing on older women, it's ageist.
If I might just jump in here and just so that we get some feedback from Rebecca's group. Thank you.
Amazing group of very talented folk and quite a cross-section of experience. We were talking about whether there's gender inequality in responses, cultural engagement, and the challenges that different cultures and experiences have to do as well. And in relation to does age play a factor in the responses? My group was of the view that it shouldn't. Um, but obviously, we've all experienced situations where assumptions are made and people are led to deal with the process for a person, maybe based on where they're at age-wise, rather than what's the situation going for them and how should we deal with them in a more holistic view, taking into account their preferences and so forth. Um, and culturally, we were quite lucky with our participants' experiences. They have some really relevant experiences in dealing with people from different cultures, and just the fact that different cultures value women differently, and so people come to Australia or are raised in Australia with their own cultural backgrounds, and they have uh, a different understanding of their rights and of what's acceptable. And it is often not even them that reports their experience because it's inadvertently come to them through a support worker or someone else has noticed or cited something. And then it's discovered, oh, this person's been putting up with all of this for how long? And they didn't know it was a problem, not necessarily something they were wanting, but they didn't know they had any rights or avenues or that it was something to be complained about.
Yeah, Rebecca, really powerful insights. And I think one of the things we're really conscious of with the Ready to Listen in residential aged care is that we need to reach out to culturally diverse groups to understand sexual assault responses and what that means for them. But I think one of the other things that we're noticing as well too, we're going to be developing a culture map, which is about understanding that we all have culture, that we all have values and beliefs and practices that are shaped by our historical experiences. And if we understand that, then we understand what we take into our work, and it's all the more reason to develop policy in education, because what we're doing is acknowledging the diversity of the workforce, that we all have our culture, values and beliefs, our own personal perspectives and ways of being, but this is best practice. This is what the organisation expects.
Yeah.
So I think it's about being embracing of culture as something that's critically important, and then setting a benchmark.
Absolutely. The group overall was of the view that they're hopeful that the current older persons group will be the last of the silent sufferers, that there's more of a groundswell of awareness, reporting and understanding, and hopefully we're travelling forwards with this.
Fantastic. My hope too.
Mm.
Oh, Karen, we can't hear you.
Oh, that's better. Yep, we've had some really rich discussions. Thanks, Catherine. And we've got a couple of questions that we'll pose to you, and they're about the reporting. And we had some very interesting discussions about that. So basically, it's about the new reporting requirements. And so if a community client discloses abuse but declines the offer to report, what are some of the organisations that can help support aged care providers and resources?
So is that, Karen, is that the new requirements? So SIRS?
Yeah, so SIRS.
Yep.
So yeah, and it's that tension. If the person doesn't want it to be taken any further, you know, there's also like a resource question, where to take it, and where does the organisation sit?
Yeah, so I haven't seen the guidelines for reporting SIRS in home services relating to sexual assault at this point, but there's been some really interesting discussions around residential aged care, and there is now mandatory reporting. So all sexual assaults have to be reported as a priority one, and there's a full stop there. But then when it comes to police reporting, we've developed some guidelines on police reporting, and so drawn on resources on police reporting sexual assault and people with disability. And there are some really good guidelines out there that really set out that a victim survivor who doesn't want sexual assault reported to the police can do so in the following. There's some really clear guidelines on that thing, thankfully, because it's really murky. And you know, some of those circumstances are that if the person has a cognitive impairment, if the person who asked for it not to be reported is a perpetrator, those kinds of, if there's an ongoing risk, I think if the perpetrator is a service provider, you know, there's some of the terms and conditions. But we've got to have those kind of clear guidelines, even so they can be challenged. That, you know, if you've got the guidelines in black and white, then people can look at them and go, well, 0.5 I'm not happy with. Well, let's have that discussion and that debate. But at the moment, we've not had guidelines, and that means that people are really unclear. So one of the things that we need to do, you know, in trauma-informed services is really think about the ways that we can promote the autonomy of victim survivors who've been sexually assaulted and then don't want to report, and then the reporting needs to occur for any of those reasons I've talked about. And how do we promote their autonomy so they're not feeling that they've lost more control?
Yeah, but so going back to your presentation, Catherine, about generating options, which is the practical working of how you promote someone's autonomy. And sometimes that can be at a slower speed than we're all comfortable with. And we had some discussion around that. So that sounds really useful about understanding, you know, SIRS, but also the need to work with more clarity, generally speaking. Yeah, so are you aware of, you've sort of brushed over the guideline, what stage the guidelines are in, or they're not yet developed?
Sorry, Karen, you cut out. What was the question?
Oh.
Apologies.
No, that's okay. It's just, I think people are really interested in that intersection with SIRS and autonomy. So, and maybe just sort of teasing that out a bit about, you know, who could organisations collaborate with, you know, in light of that SIRS.
Yeah, well, yes. Well, we need to see what SIRS comes up with for sexual assault at home. And then I think one of the things, because we've got police as state and territory based, one of the things that we've done in developing these guidelines is we thought that they would be really helpful, you know, if there could be some sort of an intersexual gathering in states and territories. And so, for example, you take those police guidelines, and if there could be an ADA, Queensland Police, sexual, you know, Gold Coast Centre Against Sexual Violence, Family Violence Services, if there could be a bringing together of those folk, and then and service providers, you know, like the state-based peaks and some of the service providers, and then looking at those guidelines and saying, well, how can we localise these guidelines to the Queensland context? That's kind of one of the purposes of those guidelines, is developing a kind of a starting point. I think it would be incredibly useful to be able to bring together the different services, because this is so new. The conversations about sexual assault at home are so new for older people, and so to be able to bring together some of those peaks and say, you know, let's have a look at some of the guidelines, and maybe, you know, even come up with an information sheet, you know, sexual assault at home, and these are the people you can contact, could be really valuable. But I think for now, until we know what SIRS comes up with, find out who your local family violence service is, find out who your local sexual assault service is, If you can't meet with them personally, do a phone hookup to introduce yourself. And having that relationship is incredibly useful. And then I think, again, to ADA and ADA law, you know, you've got that service that's there, I presume, 5 days a week. And you can ring ADA and say to them, well, who should we contact in relation to that? So there's some of the things for starters. And then I think, you know, when we find out what's the shape of SIRS and sexual assault at home, I think that we need to check in again, and I think we need to develop, you know, ideally develop some resources that help people understand, you know, how to operationalise that, I guess, you know, like we have with residential aged care. We've developed policies for res care services on sexual assault and developed them in a way that people can take them and then localise them. We've developed audit tools. We've developed, you know, about 40 educational resources. I think we need to do this for at home because it's a really different context and needs to take into account the experiences of people living in rural and remote communities in particular.
Excellent. That's a very good wrap up from you, Catherine, and it helps people understand where the next steps are. And yeah, I think sometimes we can be a bit harsh on ourselves. Why don't we know all the answers? But then they're not known, and a lot of the answers lie in that high level intersector collaboration and calling out ageism, and, you know, like, where is the response for older people and older women in particular? And you've got ageism and ableism when you have, you know, the cognitive impairment issues that loom in this population as well, and people choosing, rightly so, to stay at home for longer. But what does that look like? How can we keep people safe is part of the next big conversation. There's also, from the discussion around, you know, the peak bodies around elder abuse and responses as well, and bringing those groups along, and education. So there's lots of conversations, education, and the more you reach out and develop that relationship with your local network, the better you're going to be able to respond the next time and the next time, even though it's difficult the first time, and to reach out, and the people you're reaching out to might not be comfortable, but it's, as you develop relationships with your clients and other colleagues, it's a broader sector into collaboration. So we basically just have a minute left, and I'd like just to very much thank you, Dr. Catherine Barrett, for all your wisdom and enthusiasm and passion that you've brought today, and encouraging us, you know, about taking the next steps and having the conversations. What I took away was, you know, about building bridges and being prepared to sort of build bridges with other organisations. I'd also like to just quickly let our Queensland audience know that most police areas do have a vulnerable persons unit, so that might be the particular person that you ask for, you know, who's the vulnerable person officer, and do have a person in relation to older people and people with disability in head office in Queensland. So basically, I also like to thank the audience and also my staff for their participation in the event today. Once the recording and the associated literature will be available to people who've registered for the event, and you'll find that link in available shortly. So once again, thank you very much for your attendance today. Thank you.